Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for being here. Very, very excited to moderate this event by my friend, Tehmina Khan. But before I can introduce her formally, I'd like to say that she was also my neighbor in Islamabad, and I always remember her as this beautiful older sister of my bratty friend who used to routinely fight with me. And I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that she is a writer. And, to introduce her, she was born in Karachi and now she lives in Toronto with her two children and dog named Luna. And her novel, Things She Could Never Have, I've forgotten my copy downstairs, let me just. Things She Could Never Have has been published by Mackenzie House. Yes. Is that right? Yes. And with us is Nadya Chishty Mujahid, who teaches at IBA, and she is a regular reviewer for Dawn in the South Asian magazine. She's done many, many other things, and I've sort of edited it out because I'm very aware of the time limit. So a very, very accomplished women sitting with me. And I just want to say to Tehmina, because I haven't really had a conversation with you personally, is that I read your short stories, and I was frankly really amazed by the restraint of your style. The restraint and the simplicity, and also the wide range of experiences. I mean, if you read her stories, they are about a 19-year-old Canadian girl who has run off to ISIS. They are about a college romance gone wrong. They are about, there's one story, Things She Could Never Have, about the trials and tribulations of a transgender woman. But the one that really sort of affected me, because I had gone through this, is the story on miscarriage. Yes. I thought that was very sensitively portrayed. But I think my absolute favorite is the last one, the last story. And could I ask you, before I hand the question and answer session over to Nadya, to read an excerpt from that story, and then I think that really stipulates her style and her anxieties and the themes that we find throughout the stories, and then we can talk more about her other stories. All right?
Right. So thank you, Shazaf, for that. That was a lovely introduction. And I actually wanted to mention that she and my younger brother used to play together.
And fight together.
Yes,
all the
but
time.
she took that line from me. So I'll just get along with reading the story. So I'll introduce the story first. It's the last one in the collection. It's called Come Listen to Me. Sabko awaaz aa rahi hai? Yes? Okay. And I wrote this story after reading a book called Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition by Kamila Bhesan and Ritu Menon. It's a collection of first-person accounts of women who lived through the partition of India, and one particular woman's voice got stuck in my head. So months after I'd read that book, I just couldn't get her out of my mind. And the reason was because this woman, night after night, even though there was death all around her, she insisted on getting dressed up and singing songs with her cousins. And so I fictionalized it and borrowed parts of her story. The story I wrote is in the form of an internal monologue, I guess, or sort of a love letter to her dead husband. So here's the final bit of that story. Memories mingle with my blood and flow through my veins. Do you remember when I trailed my hair over your body and then refused you? I have never seen you as angry as you were that night. I only meant to tease you a little. I see you. Oh, I would never refuse you anything again, my love. I see you, hear you, smell you, and touch you in my dreams. And in those early moments of waking up, I lose you all over again. On such mornings, I close my eyes and try to slip back into my dream of you, but you refuse to return. There has never been anyone since you. 40 years ago, when I still lived with my elder brother's hut, there was a man who forced himself on me. I was sitting in a field relieving myself when he jumped on me. But let's not waste time on him. He was a dog. I am a woman. I washed his filth off me, but my sister-in-law saw the marks on my body. That woman humiliated me in front of my mother, my brother, our relatives, and the whole village. That day, I left my brother's house and have lived in this ashram ever since. You didn't know this, did you? I never told you. See how there's still things about me that you don't know. Why didn't I tell you this before? Why bother wasting time by telling stories of bitches and dogs? I'm a woman and I have better stories to tell. There are days when the buzzing of the beehive in my brain threatens to rupture my skull. On those days, I step outside. There's a dead kika tree behind the ashram. It stands, gnarly arms outstretched, as if calling out, "Come, listen to me." I often sit back, resting against its rough trunk, and I listen to the whispering of the wind in its naked branches, whispering of the things that once were, of light green fern-like leaves and yellow flowers. I am the tree. But don't think that I'm unhappy. There's a roof over my head, food that I cook for myself, and clothes that I stitch so well. There's pleasure in being alive, spiced with a few regrets. Sometimes I wish we had had kids, so that I could see you in their faces, listen to you in their speech, realize you in the angles and contours of their bodies, and rejoice you through the living of their lives. But then I remind myself, I still have you. I have you here, within me, listening to my stories. Thank you.
That was absolutely beautiful. And Nadya, I think you also had many things to say about her writings.
Oh, yes.
Yes. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Shazaf. I think that the story that moved you would resonate with many women, and that is what is remarkable about this collection, that Tehmina takes some very controversial or very personal topics and then using very elegant writing, which does make a difference as opposed to crude writing, which I'm not a fan of. In very elegant writing, goes ahead and presents the central point behind many pressing social concerns, especially those that deal with women, that deal with love. I'd like to get to the story of the title, Things She Could Never Have. That's really what, in a sense, is pivotal for me in the book, because it is a very moving tale about a transgender person who is rejected by a member of a family. I'm not going to go ahead and spoil the story, but of course deeply is human and deeply cares about the family as such. And this is, we are one of the, I believe, only countries in the world to give transgenders a separate vote on the ballots, which they fought for and got. And and transgenders have been part of subcontinental culture for hundreds of years. Would you like to talk more to the audience about your inspiration behind this story, and what moved you to write the titular story here?
So, I've always read a lot, and so a couple of years back, I read a book called Annabelle by Kathleen Winter. I think she's a Canadian writer, and that book made me consider things I frankly had never considered before. So when I was younger, I lived in Karachi and Islamabad, and when we'd be walking down the street, very often we'd see transgender people, and I don't know, maybe because of the things I'd heard or the way we spoke about people like that, I was always scared of them. So I would stay away. But when I read that book, it made me, for the first time in my life, and I think I was already in my 30s, it made me realize that our attitude is so wrong, that a transgender person is a human being, just like us. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female or trans or whatever, you're a human being. And that story stayed with me. And when I started writing these stories, I guess that's what came out.
Picking up from there, the theme of love, I believe I commented on this in my review, but I'd like you to elaborate on this personally. What Tehmina is very, very good at in all her stories, and I've reviewed them, is depicting love in many forms. I was recently reading Kamla Shamsi's Home Fire, which is based on the Antigone myth. And there is a very telling exchange there between Sophocles' Antigone and her patriarchal uncle Creon, where she says, well, she's disobeying him, and she says, I was made for love, not hate. And then his answer is hard and unpleasant, and he says, then get thee to the realm of the dead, for if thou must love them, while I live no woman shall rule me. But the point is that love, gentleness, suffering, sorrow, even sweet things like the love children display in this text. Some at times it's positive, but often it is, of course, fraught with tensions and so on. It's a very important element of literature through the ages, and I think you've done a brilliant job in capturing it. Could you talk more about what it was that enabled you to achieve this?
Okay, so here's a confession. When I sat down to write these stories, I didn't do it with a theme in mind. It was just, so the story gets longer now. I wrote the very first story when my daughter, who's sitting right there, started kindergarten. And that story was This Is Our Secret, which is based on something that happened to me when I was 7 or 8 years old. And it's a personal story, a difficult story, because it's about somebody molesting me when I was a child.
Oh my goodness.
But once I'd written that story, and that story took me years to write. But once I was done writing that story, I realized that, hey, I can actually write stories. So then after that, each time something upset me, I did the only thing I knew how to do at that point. I wrote a story. So the story about the miscarriage, I wrote because my best friend had a miscarriage. And she lived in England, and I didn't know how to console her. And so I sat down and I wrote a story. I was upset about transgender issues, so I wrote 2 stories about that. But again, with me, I'm a very romantic person, and I am also a very naive person, and I am naive on purpose. It's a choice that I make every single day. I want to believe in love. So I meet people who are cynical, and they kind of mock me, and they'll talk about how love is just something in your head and it doesn't exist. And of course, every emotion exists only in your mind, right? So the same way hate exists, love exists. If you feel it, it's real. And so I guess, yes, I love that you picked out on that love theme in all of these stories, because that is something that is very important to me.
Yeah, and I think that, thank you for saying that, because I think that all the stories that I read, they showed someone who empathized keenly with other people. And one of the things I struggle with as a writer is how to not draw from my own life, but to actually put myself in another person's shoes. And this, I mean, for me, I think I understand why you wrote about that, because writing about a trauma in some ways empowers you. There's another theme that I wanted to ask you about. That I have noticed a certain anxiety of religion. Yes. Could you talk about that? Please, come on, let's do this. Let's have fun. Hold on. Can you hear her with the mic? No, we can't. इसको आप mic को ठीक करें या मेरा mic ले लें आप?
Hello? No, this one is not.
मेरा वाला या आप इधर आ जाएं अगर ये नहीं ठीक हो रहा तो ठीक करें बिल्कुल ऑफ हुआ अगर हाँ
Hello?
करीब होके ना आई थिंक बात करें
Yeah.
अब can you hear her say something?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So I'm very uncomfortable speaking about religion.
Good, now I'm going to ask you more about it. Yes, go ahead.
So I started my life as a child, as a very religious child, because my nani, my dadi, my mother, they're all very religious women. And I think the strongest influences in my life have been the women I grew up around. So one of my earliest memories is of praying. So my nani would be praying and I'd stand next to her and I'd wear my little dupatta and, go through all my, I think even in my teens, I was still very religious. Now, I don't know whether I should say this, but then eventually when I was about 17, I picked up the Quran and I read it. And I felt it didn't address me. It didn't speak to me. It addressed men. And I guess that's where my conflict started. So on one hand, I am very drawn to our religion. And on the other hand, I have this battle with it because I feel it is not talking to me as a woman.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
My mic is not working. Ask your mic speak that
So I think that's very important. But I also think that in some ways, even if the Quran did not address you, I think I find this with a lot of people who have this anxiety of religion, that they choose humanity and to humanize the other. Because I think you felt yourself as the other, so you put yourself constantly in the position of the other in your stories. And I'm fascinated by that. I was just filling in the silence.
Thank you, Shazaf. Very kind of you. Tehmina, your stories speak of many things. Karachi, Lahore, Istanbul, terrorism, transgenders, women's issues, children class issues as well on some fronts. So there's an incredible diversity and a width of scope there. Where do you get that from? I mean, we are so inundated by media, and a lot of us pick up all sorts of things, but your book is special in that whatever it does, it portrays with a certain degree of authenticity, and yet it covers a lot of ground. So why do you think that is so? I mean, you wrote these stories over many years, I assume, etc. Some of them perhaps a little more mature than others. But the collection then came together, and it's very diverse, which is another compliment of this book. I think we can stop briefly for the azan, but you can think about the answer while the azan is going.
No anxiety of religion here.
Upset me, and I do follow a lot of the news. I'm kind of addicted to listening to the radio. And so each time, so for example, the ISIS story, I was dropping my kids to school, and because we live in Toronto, it was winter time, and the weather was really terrible, and I had the CBC on, and they had a news story about a girl living in Edmonton, I believe, who came from, they didn't say it, but I sensed that it was probably a Pakistani family, and she'd run off to join ISIS. And they interviewed her sister, and the sorrow in the sister's voice was such that I probably should have pulled up, because I cried all the way home. And I came home and I cried some more, and then I made myself a cup of tea and I sat down and I began that story.
I have a question I'll pose for both of you, because you are both creative writers and I am just a boring critic, an academic, and I have, no, honestly, yes, we have
that you're far from boring.
we are power when it comes to
lots of power.
criticism. ठीक है? अच्छा, but you guys are the actual writers, the creators, all right? Could you both speak about your approaches to creative writing and creativity? Because audiences are very interested in that, and they vary from person to person, but there are sometimes surprising commonalities.
Can I add to that question? So I actually wanted to ask you this when you were doing your book launch, but I'm a little shy, so I was shy about raising my hand and asking, and now I'm going to sit here and ask you instead. So you mentioned that you wrote your first book sort of organically because you were kind of angry and that's where it came from. And then you talked about your second book, and you talked about how you actually crafted it with a plot and the protagonist, and so why the difference in approach?
Because the first was very much drawn from my life, whereas the second was I was not writing what I didn't know.
Okay.
So it was not my comfort zone. But this is your event and your launch. So I like the attempt and deflection, but I'm going to deflect it back to you. And we're interested in your approach. How do you approach? Because again, like Nadya said, the scope and the breadth of these stories is, and the sensitivity with which they're written, you don't think that there's a journalist writing the stories. It's very much a writer putting herself in other people's shoes.
Right.
So how do you do that?
Again, I'm repeating myself over and over again. So each of the stories was because I was really upset.
Upset, yes.
But then saying that, I am now writing my third book. The second one is about 1,001 Nights. And I love 1,001 Nights. That's my obsession. And I've read many different versions of 1,001 Nights. But all of those versions, there was something that upset me, again, upset. And so my retelling is through the perspective of, so all the protagonists in my stories are women. And then I've changed the ending again as well because that also upset me. But 1,001 Nights for me was actually me having fun. So that's a very different book from this one. And then
I was just going to ask you, because this is from your experience, but here we're retelling other stories. Are you a little more free? Because I can sense a lot of restraint.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that will be gone with someone else.
Yeah, they're making a little din there about time, but this is a very important point, and I'm not going to listen to the din till you address this. You know, interestingly, your stories are linked. The way Shehrazad would link things, you know, break off, begin again, break off, go on and on until finally she ended the story, and Shehryar looked at her and she smiled and said, all right, now you can execute me. Ab kar lo jo karna. But there is that link, and if you read closely, it's interesting to see how they are linked. Now in novels, of course, that happens within chapters, but that is a Shehrazad aspect to your stories, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
But so now I'm working on a novella, and the novella is based on my Nani's life. But with this one, so I've written a first draft, which I didn't like. Then I wrote a second draft. I'm halfway through that. But now I'm going to start a third draft, and I'm going to do what you're doing. I'm actually going to sit down and I will make a plot and I'll craft the whole thing out and then I will rewrite it again. So, yeah.
Yeah, we have to wrap up. This was too short.
All right. Thank you very much. सवालात के लिए भी time नहीं है.
You can ask questions.
We can ask questions.
Yeah.
So does anyone have any questions to ask Tehmina? जी एक सवाल यहाँ पर है सामने. इधर माइक ले आइए.
I do not have a question. I just have one comment to make, and I think that touched my heart. And that was to remain naive by choice.
Yeah.
I think it has lots of strength. Thank you.
Thank you.
कोई और सवाल किसी के? Does anyone have any other question? जी इनके पास है.
My name is Nasir, and I'm also an aspirant writer. And I just want to ask you, ma'am, that how do you break yourself free from the, the fog of not being a writer? Because it's within you. And what is the first step that you suggest us to take?
So, this is my first book. And even now, so I am a published writer, but even now when I go anywhere and people ask me, what do you do? I'm quiet for a minute or two and then I think, oh my God, what should I say? What do I do? What do I do? And then I sort of say, very sheepishly, I'm a writer. Because I still feel I don't own that. So I don't know how you break that. I have no idea.
My name is Azmat Ansari. I'm a journalist and a writer myself. I think all that the author said was very interesting, very relevant. And one, perhaps she may have mentioned it somewhere, my motivation for writing, I recently completed my autobiography, is a great desire to share my experiences with others. Because you don't have an audience, you cannot create, so I think this aspect perhaps you might like to talk on, or
Yes. Yeah. So when I began writing, this is something I used to think about. Why bother writing? So initially I started writing because it was just therapeutic. But then obviously I started approaching publishing houses and I wanted to be published. And I used to think about that. Why am I doing this? Why do I want to be published? And that's the reason, because I think as a person, I guess everybody feels this way. I feel lonely. There's a part of me that feels completely alone. And I want other people to feel what I feel. And it's my way of reaching out. So when somebody who's read my book approaches me and says, I felt your words, there's nothing like that joy. And that's what I want. I just want someone else to connect with, and that's my way of doing it.
That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.
My name is Parvez Ahmed, member American Center Science Club, which used to exist in 1984, 83, 82, during the tenure of Shaukat Saab in the American Consulate, G. Former. Presently, I am with Lincoln Corner, Pakistan American Cultural Center. My question is, why God created women physically so weak?
Well, I guess you'll have to ask God that.
Very good answer, yes.
Perhaps because they are mentally stronger than men.
जी एक और सवाल उधर है और फिर
This is Liaquat Ali Brai from final year English literature. So this is your first book which you have published, right? So I want to know that what are your feelings right now, and what was your opinion behind this book which you have published?
I think, how do you feel?
So I think you're asking me how I feel about the book being published. Yes, excited. I'm happy, I'm excited. And one of the things I always wanted, so this book was published in Toronto, in Canada. And one of the things I always wanted was to see it in Pakistan. So today, sitting up here in Karachi, and this book being here makes me really happy.
That's wonderful. जी यहाँ पे भी एक सवाल था आपके जी.
I read Alif Laila 50 years ago. So how did you get your inspiration from Alif Laila or Arabian Nights?
How do I get it? So मेरी
my favorite book.
so मेरी नानी मुझे कहानियाँ सुनाती थी जब मैं छोटी थी. तो हर रोज रात को दोपहर को मैं साथ बिस्तर में उनके लेटती थी और मुझे कहानी सुनाती थी. अक्सर वो कहानियाँ कुरानी कहानी होती थी लेकिन अलिफ लैला की भी होती थी. So I think that's where my fascination began. But then also I like reading. So I think the first time I read Arabian Nights I was maybe 18 or 19. And I read it twice. I read it once, I put it away, I picked it up again. And since then I've read it I don't know how many times. It's an obsession.
And also you have this thing in common with Shahrazad is that she also wanted to connect with the evil emperor with her stories.
Yeah.
So we are the evil emperors. कोई और सवाल?
एक सवाल सवाल नहीं है बल्कि मैं ये कहना चाहूँगी जैसा कि तहमीना ने कहा कि किसी बात से उनकी दिल को लगती है फिर वो कहते हैं तो उन्होंने कहानियाँ लिखी हैं. तो एक मीर साहब ने 200 साल पहले जो कहा था वो आज भी उस पर सादिक आता है. दर्द व गम कितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया. हमको शायर न कहो मीर के साहिब हमने दर्द व गम कितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया.
वाह 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 बिल्कुल. Do we have time left? We don't have time. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for coming, and I would like to thank Nadya, Chishty, Mujahid, and Tehmina Khan for writing such a beautiful book and asking such wonderful questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Applause for Tehmina.
Hello.